Okay, thank you very much, Sheila. Well, hello from wherever you are joining us in the world. My name is Roger Jenkins. I'm here in Singapore. And I think for this one, we have almost or over 240 people apparently have registered. I don't think we're going to have everybody on for this particular session, but it does mean that people will be watching Feast, perhaps reading Feast for the very first time. So I'm delighted that we have so many of our members have actually managed to log on and join us from, particularly from, I see from India and Singapore, Australia, and it's good to welcome our guest from Spain today as well. So everybody a very warm welcome from the Federation of Asian Storytellers. We try to have a webinar every month, and in the months that we don't have a webinar, then we will have a story swap as a way that we can share our skills. And so we're particularly delighted today to welcome to share online for the first time with us, Dr. Margaret Read MacDonald. But Margaret has spent made many trips, not only here to Singapore, but also to India and many other countries in Asia, and so we are very familiar with her work and delighted to have her sharing with us today. And before I hand over to Margaret, who is a long way away from us on the west coast of America, and in fact she's a day behind. It's still Thursday. Oh, sorry, no, it's not Thursday. I'm losing track of time where I am because of this lockdown. It's yesterday. For her. Because we have so many people, if you have a question that you would like to pose, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, if you're not familiar with Zoom, that there is a chat button, and you are able there to post a question to us, and later on during this session, then we'll try and give Margaret the opportunity to answer some of your questions. Okay. At some point during the session, we'll also be going into a slide share, which I'm going to be doing for the first time. So fingers crossed I don't mess that up. So fair enough. So Margaret, thank you so much for joining us. I gather it must be about 9 o'clock there with you? You're about 15 hours behind us. Is that correct?
9 o'clock.
Wow, and you're looking very good. And I gather you've got the kids off the internet, so hopefully you're not having to compete for bandwidth with them.
Yes, they're going to bed, hopefully, like my grandkids.
Yeah, sure thing. So you're really one of those people that one says almost like, you know, you need no introduction because I think storytellers are very, very familiar, if not with you in person, then if they don't have at least one of your anthologies on their shelf, I'd be very surprised. So thank you for agreeing to talk with us today.
I'm glad to be here. Should I take off now? I'm ready to go?
I think that would be great.
Okay. Well, I'm glad to see all of you here, and I was amazed at how many people were excited about this topic. I was asked to talk to you about how to turn a folktale into a piece that you can actually publish. And there are a lot of things to think about when you worry about this situation. The first is, what is a folktale? And I'm sure you all know what a folktale is, but it's good to remind yourself a folktale is a story that's passed from person to person to person. You cannot make up a folktale. Somebody's got a racket going on there. I don't know. Roger, I think you need to be muted.
Oh, okay.
Okay, thank you. So a folktale is passed from person to person to person, and that's the definition of a folktale. So if you create a story that sounds like a folktale, it's not a folktale, it's an original piece, and you can publish it because you made it up. If you find a folktale in a printed form, which you want to retell, you have to make sure it's a folktale, and it might not be a folktale. It could be something that somebody else made up, that they made up in a folktale format and wrote down and published in a book. So your first task is to find out if the story that you want to publish and retell is in fact a folktale. Because if it's an authored piece, it's under copyright and you cannot take it and make it your own and rewrite it. If it's a folktale, folktales are considered public domain, so you can in fact retell a folktale. However, you can't take the exact words of a folktale from a text and retell them and publish it again under your name, because the original words would have been under copyright for the reteller who published them. So it's all really very tricky. So let's take a look at a book and see how we'll go about establishing whether a book we have, a story we have, is actually a folktale or not. So Roger, have you got the first slide we can take a look at? There you go. Tiki Tiki Tembo. It's a story that a lot of you know. And so, well, is it a folktale? If it is, you could retell it and make your own version. But let's see. So to find this out, we look at the book and see what the book says. The book says it's retold by, on the title page, it says it's retold, on the cover it says retold by Arlene Moselle. So retold implies that it is a folktale that's been retold. School Library Journal reviewed it and said this old folktale. So they thought it was a folktale. That's another clue, it's a folktale. And the story begins, once upon a time, a long, long time ago, it was the custom of all fathers and mothers in China to give their first and honored sons great long names. This implies, and it's a folktale. The Library of Congress thought it was. They classified it as J398.20951 and gave it subject headings of folklore of China. And I thought it was a Chinese folktale too. And so when I did my storyteller source book, I classified it as a Chinese folktale. But a friend of mine took me to task. She is a scholar of Chinese and Japanese folklore, and she said I should look at the next slide, slide number 3. She told me to go look at the Yanagito Kunio Guide to the Japanese Folktale. And in there, over 20 Japanese sources for this tale are cited. And the story is described as a child with a long name fell into a well. He drowned while his name was being called. If you don't know the story, Tiki Tiki Tembo falls into a well, and his brother Chang has to get the old man with a ladder to get him out. And because his name is so long, Tiki Tiki Tembo no Sa Rembo Chari Baravuchi Pit Peri Pembo, his name is so long that he almost drowns before he's gotten out. And the story says, because of that, all Chinese families give their children short names like Chang. So it's obviously was, said to be a Chinese folktale, and people tell it as that. However, in fact, it appears to be a Japanese folktale. I don't know if any of the Japanese sources talk about it being a Chinese boy or not, but obviously it's not a Chinese folktale, it's a Japanese folktale. So for some reason, the author wanted to make a picture book of a Chinese folktale and just retold it and pretended it was a Chinese folktale. If anyone can find a Chinese version, I'd be very interested, because my friend who told me that I was wrong thinks it's only Japanese, and I tend to think that she's right about that. So this is what happens. You have to really search to find out if it's a folktale and if it actually has the right attribution. Is it really from China or not? So next slide. The Asian Art Museum. The Asian Art Museum in while he's looking for it, I'll talk about the next slide. The Asian Art Museum in San Francisco asked me to vet some of the stories that their docents were telling, because they wanted to make sure that these stories were all actually Asian folktales and from the right culture. And one of the stories they were concerned about was Mei Ling and the Dragon. It's a fun little story about a little girl who feels sorry for the dragon because he never gets a birthday, and she takes a birthday cake to the dragon for a birthday party, and he gives her a ride on his back down the river. And the docents really liked to tell that, and there were dragons in their exhibit. They stop with the dragon and tell Mei Ling and the Dragon. But something about it made them a little little nervous, and me too, because taking a birthday cake doesn't sound quite like a Chinese folktale. I don't know. So to pursue it, I started with the source that they had taken it from, which was Multicultural Fables and Fairy Tales by Tara McCarthy, Scholastic Press, and the story was called Mei Ling and the Dragon. And in my searching, I found that there were other versions. There was a version by Isabel Chang called the Teardrop Dragon in Chinese Fairy Tales. And there was a version called Mei Ling and the Dragon, a little reader by the Wright Group. And so, well, we have 3 versions. So, well, it must be a folktale. There are 3 different versions now. We know it's a folktale, I guess. So I ordered a copy of Multicultural Fables and Fairy Tales to take a look at the source that the folks were using to see if that book might tell what source the author had used. And they don't always, but that one did. Her source was a story called The Dragon's Tears in Japanese Children's Stories by Florence Sakati. Japanese children's stories. That's called Mei Ling and the Dragon. Makes sense. So I ordered the Sakati book, and Sakati gave her sources, and she said the folktale collection actually includes 2 modern stories. The Dragon's Tears is a modern story, and the author is Hirosuke Hamada. So it's not even a folktale, it's an authored story. But I had another version, so I checked out Isabel Chang's version, The Teardrop Dragon in Chinese Fairy Tales, but interestingly, her version and Sakati's version were almost identical. And Sakati was Chinese American, born and raised in the US. She was a librarian, a children's librarian in Boston. The Sakati book came out in 1959, and her book came out in 1965. So it just seems really clear that Sakati, that Chang had taken the book, the story from Sakati, retold it, and set it in China to fit into her collection of Chinese fairy tales. It was so close to the Sakati story that I cannot believe that she found another version in actual Chinese culture. And then our third source, Mei Ling and the Dragon, was from a reader. And I know that the Wright Group don't cite their sources and don't pay attention to sources, because they published a reader of Elephant and the Bees, which was clearly taken from a book that myself and Suratana Prida had published in the US. And they didn't consult us and didn't cite us. So we did all this research and found out this is not a folktale at all. It is actually a Japanese story written by a Japanese author. So I had to tell the librarians, the docents at the museum, that they probably shouldn't be using it as an authentic Chinese story. Now, this is talking about a print source. And if you have a print source, you've got to find at least two other sources, or at least one other source, to prove it's a folktale. Otherwise, there's no way you can prove that it isn't just something that somebody made up, that's an original story. As we see from that trail, even then, you've got to be sure and chase those sources back to make sure the source that you're citing isn't citing another source that's an identical source. So you can't just say, well, it appears in 5 books, so it's a folktale. They might all be citing, reprinting the exact same story, just retelling it slightly. So you've got to do some research to find out if you've really got a folktale or not. Now, another place you might find the story is in a primary source. A primary source is if you have the story from a traditional teller, in other words, straight from the horse's mouth. The person that told the story to you learned the story from a person in their culture who learned it from a person in their culture. The folktale has been passed down, and came to you in that way. If it's from a primary source, you don't have to have another source. It's obviously a folktale. Or is it? Sometimes when you have a collection of folk tales that's from a storyteller, you could assume that's a primary source. If it's clearly from a folk person, a person of the culture. But oftentimes, when a folklorist is collecting stories, the storyteller being collected gets so excited about doing this and loves so the process that they begin to look for other stories to add to their repertoire to share. So my friend Robert Adams, who was working on his PhD in Japan, the lady he was working with told him so many stories, and he kept coming back. And finally, she began to go to the library and get some books to get some more stories to tell him to make him really happy. I think they were mainly folk tales, but often grandparents and parents will find stories that aren't even folk tales that they like in a picture book or in a reader, and add them to their repertoire because they're good stories. So you can't be absolutely sure it's even a folktale just because you got it from a person in the culture. But more or less, we can assume it's a folktale then. Now, you might also have gotten the story from another teller, not a person from the culture or necessarily, but just another modern teller like all of us here are all just about. If that's the case, ask that teller what their source was and go back and track down their source, just like you try to track down the printed source that you would have used. And if they told the story and reshaped it, ask them if they mind if you retell their story. Maybe they don't want it retold. And ask them if they mind if you publish it, because they might not want it published. Maybe they're going to publish it someday, and they might not want to. So you need to give them some honor for the work that they've put into the story, and give them the respect to ask them if you can use their story or not before you go off and use it. Now, when you've done all this work and you begin and you get ready to publish, you need to be sure and cite your sources. So you need to put the author, the title, the publishing house, and the date, and add a tail note into your story with this information. If you heard it from someone as a primary source, then please put down the name of the person, where they lived, how old they were, where you collected, and when you collected the story. This will be of use to folklorists in the future when they see your version. So these are all important things to add in. Now, there are strange things happen when stories start passing around. Stories are kind of like viruses. And it can happen that an original story can become a folk tale. It can become a folk tale if it passes into the folk tradition and begins to be told over and over again and changed and changed and changed. It can become a folk tale. And an interesting example is a story that I kind of put together from some folk materials called Two Goats on a Bridge. And a lot of you tell that. I wrote a book called Peace Tales, and in that I had an Eastern European story about a goat that met another goat, and they fought and they fell off a bridge and they didn't get along. And I had another story from a completely different source about two goats that met on a bridge and they passed nicely and squeezed by and passed easily. It wasn't one story, it was two totally different stories. But I was telling stories in Indonesia. I needed a story that I could tell that didn't have much language in it. And so I created a finger play of that story, combining two stories. And the first was the first goat and the second was the second goat. And I had two stories and I put them together and made another story. So really it's a totally original story. It's based on a folktale motif, but it's an original story. And I put it in my book, and Jen and Nat, we put it in our book, and I told it all over the world. And a lot of you folks heard me tell it in Southeast Asia and India. And a lot of you guys tell the story. Jiva's smiling, Jiva tells it, Roger tells it, Sheila tells it, probably a lot of you tell the story. Yeah. And it gets told and changed a little bit, but stays pretty much the same. And at some point in time, some of you, I think, went to Kenya and told it, or else John Titi came from Kenya to Southeast Asia and heard it. But anyway, John heard it, and he started telling it. And I saw his telling on YouTube. It is a completely Kenyan folktale. It is a Kenyan folktale. He has the audience singing one song. He's singing another song. He's doing everything you do with a Kenyan folktale. He has made it. He's taken it and completely adapted it. That story, like a virus, has passed from an American teller to all over Southeast Asia, and suddenly, bam, it spread to Kenya. And who knows where it will stop and what it will be in the end. So I'm going to ask Roger to send you after this, this webinar links to that story from Kenya, of John, of his telling, and two links of Ajahn Wayupatosa from Thailand, and myself telling my version in English and Thai. So you can compare, you can see how it began with my version and how it turned out with John's version. Really, really interesting. So stories are a very interesting thing. Folklore is amazing. Now here are some tips on how you can search for variants of your tale. You need at least 2 variants if you're going to publish it. So check motif and type indexes. So I've got another slide there, Roger. Folklorists have created all sorts of indexes, motif indexes. And here's one that I did based on the Stith-Thompson Motif Index of Folk Literature. Motifs are, each story has many different things that happen in it. So in Cinderella, Cinderella goes to the ball 3 times. She has a glass slipper that she loses. She has a wicked stepmother. These are all motifs. And so I actually put together for my PhD, I worked on this, and I did a book called The Storyteller's Source Book. And I indexed 550 collections of folk tales published for children and 425 picture books. And for each of those, each story in each of those books, I indexed it by all the different motifs that were in there, by subject and by title. And you can look under title, subject, or motif and find your story. So if you go into this book and you find your story in there, you know it's a folk tale. And it's probably going to reference 2 or 3 other versions that you could that you can get. And then and you have it in your handout, all the information about this. This is published in 1982, and Brian Sturm and I did a supplement in 1990 that has even more stories. And we haven't done an update since then, but it doesn't really matter because it doesn't have to be recent. If you get in any of these books and you find your story, you know it's a folktale, and you can verify that it's a folktale. And so I checked online with the Singapore Main Library, and you also have there a type index of Korean folktales and a type index of Chinese folktales, and maybe a lot more. So there are all kinds of indexes that you can find if you plow around and look. If you go to a university library, if they have a folklore program or anthropology program, they're definitely going to have several of these indexes. So go to the biggest university that you can find that has a liberal arts education program going on. Go to the biggest public library you can get to and take a look for these indexes. Also, go online and look for folk tales. The ones you find there are not going to be told very well, and just because you find it online doesn't mean it's a folk tale. You'll often, because people will look online, they'll find a story, they'll start telling it, they'll retell it and put it up on their own website, and you might find 10 versions of the story, and it still might not even be a folk tale. But if you find a lot of versions of the same story, it gives you a clue that maybe it is a folk tale. And that kind of encourages you to get back to the library and start looking to see if you can find some more print sources. And some of the sources online will actually give their sources, but most of them don't bother. They don't bother. And a lot of them are not very well told. There is one really useful online source, and I've listed it in your handout. It's by Ashleman, and he has a lot of indexing there, and sources to a lot of other indexes and other collections that you can look at. So that can be one good place to take a look online. Now, next, library research. You've already gone, you have to go and look for your indexes, but not just that, but also the books. So when I was trying to vet this story about Mei Ling and the dragon, I went to the University of Washington Library, which is our biggest collection around here. I first went through all the indexes I could find that I didn't have at home. I have a lot at home. The Eberhard Index of Chinese Folktales, I went clear through that, looking to see if I could find a story there, and I couldn't. And then I just sat down by all the books in the Chinese folktale section, took them off one by one. I looked in the indexes if they had one. Most of them don't. Look to the table of contents, looking for any story that could be this story. And it took me a day or two to do all this, but I went through all the books they had on the shelf that were Chinese folktales. And when you go to the library, to the public library, you don't just go to the adult section, you also go to the children's section, 398.2, 398, and oh yeah, look all over, because now there are three places to look for Chinese folktales at any like 398, 398.2, and 398. Oh, that long number that I had there a while ago, because they'll appear in all these places. So ask the librarian to help you to look online. You can also look by subject and find a listing of all the Chinese folktales that are there. So it's a lot of work, but that's what you have to do to vet your story and make sure that you've got a folktale if you want to publish it. If you want to just tell it, no, you don't need all that. But if you want to publish it, you've got to make sure it's a folktale. Otherwise, you can't publish it. A folktale is public domain, but only folktales. Okay. Step 2, retell your story. About plagiarism, okay. Though folktales are public domain, you have to make sure it's a folktale. In a court of law, you can't really be sued effectively unless they can prove that you have caused them financial damage. So if I've written a picture book and you take my exact text and publish it as a picture book format, yes, my publisher can sue your publisher because you're causing us financial damage. But you have to have financial damage to actually be sued. But who's going to risk it? I wrote a book called that's called Earth Care. I wanted to call it Earth Tales, World Folklore to talk about, to match my Peace Tales book. But Caputo, who had written a book called Earth Tales, had his publisher write a 3-page single-spaced letter to my publisher saying all the ways they were going to sue us if we used that same title. Now, they couldn't have succeeded in a court of law, but who's going to run the risk and have to hire a lawyer to fight them? So I had to change the title. I called it Earth Care instead. Pretty annoying. But anyway, this is what you have to watch out for. You can use a few phrases from another text without being accused of plagiarism, but you can't use very much before it's actual plagiarism. So you can't actually take the whole text that someone else published and put it in and reprint it and say it's yours. You've got to completely retell the story. Even if you get it from another teller, you've got to retell it to make it your own. So how do you do that? First, you establish it's a folktale. We talked about that. Then you read all the versions of the story you can find. Not just the 2 you need, but as many as you can find. You read them all, and here's why. You're going to find so many neat things in the other versions. You had a version you really liked, but in this version, all of a sudden, here's this twist that, oh, you hadn't even thought about that. I love that. I'm going to put that in my story now. And this ending's different. I like the ending better. I'm going to use that ending. And oh, this is a different character. Oh, I like the way they put that in there. Look at that. And pretty soon you take all these pieces and put them together, and you have a better story than you began with. A much, much better story. So that's what you do. And then when you retell it, you use your own voice. You start telling, and you don't sit down and start typing. No, you tell it first. You tell it out loud to yourself over and over again till you like the way it sounds. And then you get an audience, and you go and you tell it to one audience, and then another audience. You tell it to some kids, some adults, different kinds of audiences. You keep telling it, and every time you tell it, afterwards, you stop, you take notes and write down, oh, wow, I said a really fun thing there. I didn't say before. I'm going to do that again. Write it down. Oh, that part didn't work. I'm going to change that. And every time you tell it, it'll get a little bit better, a little bit better, a little bit better. I always say it's like a stone rolling in a river. It gets rounder and rounder until it's just perfect. And after it's perfect, when you think this is really good now, I like it just the way it is, I don't want to change it anymore, then you type it up. And then you can go back and edit it again and keep on telling it and keep on telling it. It keeps on changing. I had an editor once who told me, once you send me the text, stop telling that story, because she'd have it all set and type. I email her, oh, it changed. You got to change it. It's better now. It looks like this. She said, once you give it to me to sit and type, I don't want you telling that story anymore. And that's what happens because it gets better and better and better and better. And it's the folk process. I'm working on a story right now called The Snot-Nosed Goat. It's from Russia. And I've been telling it to my little grandson who's in bed over here behind me asleep, I hope right now. And he really likes that story. And it's about a snot-nosed goat who carries off a girl. It's sort of like Beauty and the Beast. And he lies on top of the stove all day and she has to wipe his nose with her hanky. And that's the way it goes. And of course, in the end, she discovers he's a really man, and she throws his goat skin in the fire and he becomes a handsome prince. And they go off together, and that's the end. Pup, 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 away in their sleigh. And that's the ending. But then yesterday morning, my grandson said, "Oh, Granny Mac, do you think that she had to keep wiping his snotty nose now that he's a prince?" And I said, "Oh yeah, I'm going to change the ending." Okay. And afterwards, in the spring, when the pollen season came and he began to get allergies and sneeze, he'd wake up in the night and say, "Oh, my nose is running. Could you please wipe my nose for me?" So stories change, and your audience helps you change them and make them better and better and better. Now, once you've got the story finished and typed up, go back to your original sources and double check to make sure you aren't plagiarizing, that you haven't inadvertently taken too much from those and put in your story without changing it. Now, you need to add to your citation notes at the end of the story now information about how you changed the story. Did you maybe change the character to a girl from a boy? Did you change the ending? Did you leave out some motifs? Did you add in some motifs? Be honest with your audience and add this in a tail note at the end. And for example, I'll show you how I do that. So Roger, the next slide. How to make your story tellable. Okay. Start with a tellable source. Now, I think a lot of you know the story of the tailor. The story originated, I believe, and everyone thinks this is where it originated, with the Jewish folk tale. And here's the folk tale. And you can see I had a little overcoat as old as it can be. Whatever I do with it, I just couldn't see. I thought a little while, I made myself a jacket in the very latest style. And then the jacket was old as can be. I made myself a vest. And then 3, I had a vest, old as could be. It wore out. I made myself, what do you make next? A tie, a button, and I had nothing left. That's the folk song. But then somebody at some point in time turned it into a story. So next slide. Nancy Schimmel published a book called Just Enough to Make a Story. And she put the story, somebody says, Deepta says she's practicing the song right now. Okay, anyway, Nancy Schimmel is very close to this. Well, Roger, let's jump to you because Roger's is very close to Nancy Schimmel. So Roger's going to actually tell you a little of his version.
There's also one by Sims Tabak, isn't it?
There are many, many.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got one.
Yeah,
that's a picture book, though.
I got my own version.
Yes. Yeah, we all have our own version. Roger, can you tell him your version?
Okay. You're going to spotlight me, Sheila?
I will. Hang on.
Okay. Okay, so just to get into the story, there's a tailor and he wants a special piece of cloth that is as dark as night, as colorful as the rainbow. There's a tailor and he wants a special piece of cloth that is as dark as night, as colorful as the rainbow, as strong as steel, and as soft as silk. And one day, a package is delivered, and when he cuts it open and opens it up, what does he find inside but that cloth? And I invite the audience to join in. That cloth that is as dark as night, as colorful as the rainbow, as strong as steel, and as soft as silk. And he says, now I'm going to make myself a new suit. So he takes his scissors. Would you like to take your scissors, please? And he cuts the cloth. Snip, snip, snip. And then he sewed the cloth. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da, da-da-da-da-da-da. And with his needle, he stitched the cloth. Stitch, stitch, stitch. And he made himself a magnificent new suit. And he liked that suit so much, he wore it here, he wore it there, he wore it
everywhere.
Thank you very much. Until that suit wore out. Holes, 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 holes. And he was just about to throw it away when he looked again and said, no, there's enough material here. I can make myself a shirt, a short sleeve shirt, because we're in Singapore, it's very hot. So he took his scissors and he cut the cloth, snip, 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 and he sewed the cloth, da, 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 and he stitched the cloth, stitch, stitch, stitch. And he made himself a splendid shirt. And he liked that shirt so much, he wore it here, he wore it there, he wore it
Everywhere. Okay,
until it too was worn out.
that's good.
Thank you.
I love it. Okay, so Nancy's version had that story, and it had the refrain, he wore it and he wore it and he wore it till it was all worn out. And when you would tell her version, you would say, have the audience saying with you, he wore it and he wore it and he wore it till it was all worn out. Now, what did Roger do to make that story even more tellable? We got anybody want to hop in here?
Interactive. He made it interactive.
This is what happens.
Actions.
Action.
This is the classic thing when it shorts
Actions.
inside.
Audience
Literally, there is no
participation.
lag. You switch on it and it
Participation.
shorts. I think it shorted there.
Yes, he made it interactive. He taught the audience
He added,
story.
At a minimum.
he added sounds to the action.
No.
Yeah.
Right.
Sam?
Anybody else a hand up?
And he changed.
Something?
Audience participation.
Lots of participation. Lots of participation. Exactly. And lots of repetition. So
Yes, also repetition. Yeah,
Less
where
of
even his
language.
audience can connect and repeat after him.
Huh?
yeah.
Lesser language, I think.
It's also more tellable to younger children.
Tell us your ending, and also tell us what your source was for the story and how much you changed it from your source.
So it gets down to he makes a button, and then that get whole, he's about to throw it away, and he thinks, no, there's enough material here to make himself a story. And so we cut, and it's now very, very small. And when he has finished it, he liked that story, told it everywhere. But because it was a story, it never, I'm muted. No, okay. It never wore out. And so, yeah, so that's the story. I actually found it in a book. When I was doing a workshop, I thought this was really right at the start of my storytelling journey. And I liked the story so much, and I took it. And the part that I really was worried about remembering was the qualities of the cloth. And so because I have a kind of strong visual and physical way of remembering, I guess because of working with the sign language. And so that's why I came up with the dark as night, colorful as the rainbow. So I changed that completely. And sound is also a good mnemonic for me. Strong steel, soft silk, just to help me.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thank you, Roger. Fascinating the way these stories get changed. Someone made a note that Bobby Norfolk has a copy, has a version of the story in the moral of the story, and Bobby and Sherry. I'll take a look at that. The earliest version that I know of was the one by Nancy Schimmel. It was published in 1982, and it only had the repetition of until it was all worn out. But she didn't have snipping and cutting. But I've seen a lot of librarians and storytellers in the U.S. tell it, and they almost all use versions of the snipping and cutting. Now, okay, look at this. Look how much description she has and how long, how this goes on and on and on and on and on. This is rewritten in a very literary format. She doesn't have any of the repetition. any, there's obviously no place for the audience to participate. She's doing this for a totally different reason. She's going to want to tell this probably to adults, and it's going to be a much quieter storytelling event. But if you want to use her version, you're probably going to have to memorize it and do oral interpretation with it. So when you're looking for a story to put into your own repertoire to retell, you're better off using Roger's version or Nancy Schimmel's version or Bobby Norfolk's version to start with, because those versions are already more in an oral format than one like this that is a very literary format. Okay, back to me. I have another example of that. You can just go back to me for this. There's a story called on the tongue-cut sparrow from Japan, and one version begins like this. It was autumn, and the dawn was breaking. The forest was afire with the red of maple trees. The cranes glided down to the watery rice fields to dab for their morning meal. The croaks of the bullfrogs rumbled from riverbanks, and Mount Fuji, wreathed in clouds, breathed idly and contentedly on the distant skyline. It was a season and a morning dear to the old woodcutter's heart, neither his poverty nor the sharp tongue of his irascible wife. Anyway, it goes on for like a page and a half of small, tiny print before he ever leaves the house to go out into the woods. And then I also have the same story in a collection by Keigo Seiki, who's a folklorist. This is collected in the words of an actual Japanese storyteller. It begins, well, this is long ago. There was an old man and his wife. One day the old man went to the mountain to cut firewood. Bam, you're into the story. So an actual traditional teller usually would get cut right to the chase, get into the action and get going. So when you want to have a story that you're going to tell, you don't really want to start with this first version I showed you, which is also in a children's collection, and have to memorize or read a page and a half before you even begin the action. You want to get a version from an oral teller who's telling it in exactly the way they would tell it. And that's why it's so easy for you to take a story from the books that I've written and retell them, because they've been told a zillion times and they're shaped for telling. Stories by Bobby Norfolk and Sherry Norfolk, same way. Diane Wolkstein, same way. George Shannon. All these stories, we're tellers, we've been telling. The stories are already shaped for telling, and so they're easy for you to take and retell. So when you're looking for a story to tell, look for a tellable version. If you have a story you like, and it's really kind of turgid and long, look around for other versions, see if you can find a very tellable version to help you make it your own. I have a story that I've been telling my grandson called about an octopus. It's a Pacific Northwest Native American story, and we're sitting right now on a little island on the edge of a beach. We were down there on the beach yesterday playing around and digging clams and that kind of thing. So this is a good story for us to tell. Next slide. We're looking for the next slide. See the slide? Oh, there it is. Okay. So in that book that that book that I showed you of Japanese folktales, I read this description of a folktale, okay? Once upon a time, an octopus appeared right in front of an old woman who was doing her laundry at the beach. Although it didn't tell her to cut a leg off, it stuck out a big leg out toward her. She cut it off promptly and took it home happy to eat it. When she was done her doing a wash the next day, the same octopus came out and let her cut off another leg. This went on for 7 days. The 8th day, the old woman set out intending to be sure to get the head too. The octopus set its last leg and waited. When the old man started to cut it off, the octopus suddenly danced up to her, wound its remaining leg around her neck, and dragged her to the bottom of the sea. Okay, this is a great story. So let's see how I made it into a story that I can tell my grandson and maybe publish one of these days. Okay, next slide. So I'm calling it The Octopus and the Old Woman. And I'm citing my source that you just saw. That was the source, and this is what I made of it. And we went down to the beach to gather clams. Now you wouldn't do a laundry in the sea. I'm not sure why they wouldn't said laundry, but that was Japanese. You wouldn't wash your laundry in the salt water. Anyway, she went down to the beach to gather clams each day. She was bending down to the beach, saw a gigantic octopus emerge from the sea, came closer and closer. It looked her right in the eye, extended its one long leg on the beach and said, her leg, more leg. Stared right at her. Huh? The woman grabbed her hatchet and chopped off that leg. ran back to the beach and octopus stew tonight. Next slide. That's what she had. And of course, next day, you know what happened. Next slide. Next day, she went down to dig her clams again, and here comes the old octopus. Stared at her and stuck on another leg, one leg, and she chopped off that leg. So okay, so what am I doing to make it into a tellable story? It didn't look very tellable to me, but a good idea. What did I do? We can go back to the audience and let them give me some ideas here.
You created dialogues.
I created dialogue.
You made it repetitive.
Pardon?
Repetition.
Repetitive.
Repetition.
Simple
Suspense.
language.
Shorter words.
Sentences that are very simple.
Simple
Shorter
language.
sentences.
And
Very simple. Very simple.
some excitement into the story when she says, when the octopus says water leg, you know, it creates a lot of excitement to the listener as well as to the teller.
More scary, I think. Scary as like, calm down, you know.
Yeah. So you can see how you can take a story idea, and obviously there's repetition of the story implied in the story. And of course you have to do it 8 times to keep. Now my grandson said that the next time it should be, instead of an octopus, a septopus and a sextopus, and I'm not sure because he has less legs now, right? I don't know. Anyway, I don't think I'll go there, but anyway, you can see how you can take a little bit of a story and make it into a real story, and it's your own. I'm not plagiarizing anything. I'm just taking a story idea and making, and really blowing life into it again as a storyteller would, and bringing it back to life. Okay, now the last thing I want to talk about are the sources, and I think now we should have slide number 12. There, Party Croc. So this is a story of a crocodile, and in the actual story, well, let's see. This is the actual note that I published in the back of the book. It says the story was inspired by The Light on the Path, The African Stories by Hugh Tracy. I cite the source entirely. I talk about him. He was an ethnomusicologist. And in his book, it told the story came from the Karanga, who are a clan of the Shona people in Zimbabwe. So I had all the information available, so I put it in the notes so the user of the picture book can know this too. It was retold with permission of his ethnomusicologist son, Andrew Tracy. And in the book, The Light on the Path, it actually has the actual Karanga music, and I tell the reader that they can go and look it up if they want to and try to sing the original song. You couldn't do it because it's these things are so complicated that you could never reproduce the actual African thing unless you're an African ethnomusicologist, but it's in there, you can look at it. And I say it has the original story in which a crocodile is given alcoholic Doro to drink. And the book also happens to have another story that's similar about a grandmother. In this story, it's about a little girl, and the crocodile gives her fish, and she promises that he can come to the party in the village and have some food. There'll be a big party coming, and he can come, and she thinks he won't come, but he does come, and he eats a lot of food and stomps around and makes a mess and has to be captured by the people and thrown back in the river. But there's another story in Tracy's book in which a grandmother was given fish by a croc, and the crocodile eats her up. So it's a completely different ending. In the actual story, that's okay, you can hear me now. In the actual story that I worked with from Tracy's book, the crocodile drinks beer, Doro, and gets totally drunk. And I was telling it that way originally, and it was so much fun. So when I was telling the story to a bunch of librarians in Sioux Falls in South Dakota one time for a library conference. And in the story, I had this repeated chant: pot of beer, want another pot of beer, pot of beer, want another pot of beer. And when the banquet was over and the librarians came out and started stomping down the main street of Sioux Falls, those reference librarians were stomping down and singing, pot of beer, want another pot of beer. So that was a very successful storytelling event. I told the story at a grade school right near the library where I worked to the sixth graders. And when I told it to them, I would pick out a sixth grade boy who could belch. I'd say, who can belch? And they'd say, oh, I could belch. And then I'd say, okay. And when the croc would drink, he'd go, oh. And I'd point to the boy and he would belch. And it was very successful. So I thought that was great. And I got back to the library and I was so happy. And the phone was ringing. And the head librarian said, Margaret, it's for you. Huh? It was the principal from the school calling me. He said, Dr. MacDonald, I don't know what you told to that sixth grade class, but don't ever tell that story in my school again. Apparently the boys went stomping down the hall to their classrooms singing, pot of beer, one another pot of beer, and belching. So when I wanted to make it into a picture book, I knew I couldn't use the beer. I had to get the beer out. So I had to change it and make it a drunken crocodile. And when it came out, I sent $500 to his son, the son of Hugh, Andrew Tracy, who had agreed that I could publish the book, and he'd been helping me and look at the text. And he really didn't want me to change the beer, but I just had to. So I sent him some money. It's not a lot, but you only make about $5,000 off a picture book anyway. So it was something to kind of, token of gratitude. And he wrote me, well, actually his brother, I didn't know he had a brother. He had a brother. So his brother wrote me a nice letter back, and I sent him both a book then. And his brother said, thank you for sending me a copy of Party Croc, and thank you for the check. It all helps. Of course, you're right. I do find your version a long way from the original tale, as you say, but it certainly has its charms. My problem is that I can't easily forget the original with its song in a liberal helping of health-giving beer, also in an authentic African village where crocodiles can definitely eat you. If you're looking for a moral, you don't need to go any further than that. Watch out, crocodiles eat people. African children need to learn that. Well done in getting your story published at all, though. I understand the trials of dealing with politically correct editors and school principals and PTA parents. And thank you for the credit you gave our father on the back page. I'm so proud of all the work he did in Africa. I'm not sure about the line in the credits that say Party Croc, a folktale from Zimbabwe, retold by Margaret Read MacDonald. Being so altered from the original with its added new foreign morals, can it still be defined as a folktale from Zimbabwe? Well, you can tell that our family members tend to be sticklers for authenticity. But I thank you for asking Andrew's permission to use the story and for sending us copies. Good luck with sales. And it's true, as a folklorist, I really went too far in changing that story. But as a librarian and as a storyteller, hey, it's a lot of fun. And the story will go on and be used in the US and many, many places and be loved by a lot of children. So I think it's justified in doing that. So before we go to questions, in summary, start with a tellable folktale, find several sources, create your own version, tell it many times until it shapes itself for easy telling, cite your sources when you tell or publish it, and realize that no publisher is going to publish it for you unless you can prove it's a folktale and that you're not going to get sued for publishing it. So do your homework before you send it out there. Okay, now, do we have questions or comments or criticisms or what?
Thank you so much, Margaret. That was really good. And breaking down, I think, quite a complicated subject for us, step-by-step different aspects for us to consider. And it is one that we here at Feast have been grappling with because we are in the process of putting together our third collection of Asian folk tales on the theme of animals, which we hope will be available by July, August. And so this issue of what is a folk tale and making sure that it is a folk tale and not a original work and so on is something that is very close to our hearts at the moment. And thank you for shedding a lot of light. And there have been a number of questions, and I'm sure some more now will be turning up on the chat. But I'm going to go with a couple that came in right at the end there as you were talking about Party Croc. And people wanting to know, what is your take on telling, folk tales with gory details? In a way, you kind of answered it, that in Africa, knowing that crocodiles eat people is an important life lesson to learn. What's your, how do you approach gory details in stories with kids or stories for kids?
Okay, essentially, it really depends on your own feeling comfort with the story and with whatever's in it that's gory. I used to tell incredibly gory stories to kids at Halloween. I'd have a whole Halloween sessions and telling these totally gory stories. And now our culture has changed, and our acceptance of what is suitable for children has changed to the point where I could never get by with telling those stories. I used to tell Mr. Fox, you know, Lady Mary was young and Lady Mary was old. And in the end, you know, Mr. Fox chops off her Fox's hand, and there's a room full of bloody bodies piled up. I couldn't tell that in the public library or in a public school now. I still tell it to my own kids, my own grandkids, but I couldn't tell it there. I told it then. I felt comfortable with it. The kids loved it. I didn't have any adults really complaining about it, but the norms have changed, at least in the US, and then we just couldn't get by with doing that now. Never tell a story that feels uncomfortable to you. If you feel comfortable with it and you can make it not feel terribly scary, do it. But if you think it's really scary and brutal and gross, it's going to come across that way. If you think it's kind of camp and funny, it's going to come across that way. Just be comfortable with it. But if you can use it if you feel comfortable and if it fits. Don't be afraid of it and shy away from it. You know, psychologists have shown that, you know, this is how children learn to cope with fears, by hearing stories about scary things. So there's no reason to leave it out unless you think it's bad. If you think it's scary, don't go there. Don't go there.
Okay. Thank you. Yep. Good. Another question about, like, if you take a story such as, for example, the Taylor story, and you change the objects in the story, does it still then remain true to the spirit of a folktale?
Sure, I think so. There's no problem. Again, if I were going to publish it, I'd put a note in the back saying this originally was a Jewish folktale, and I've changed it. In fact, I tell that story here on Guimas Island. At Christmas, I told it, and I made it into a Christmas story. And I said that he was wearing the vest to church on Christmas Eve, and then the next year he wore, you know, the tie on Christmas Eve, and I made it into, and I was having the whole audience snipping and sewing with me and saying it with me, and it became, I guess, a Christian folktale, even though it's a Jewish folktale. So yeah, so no, sure, that's fine. But again, if you publish it, put a note saying how you changed it and why you changed it. And you know, there are no story police. There's no folklore police are going to get you. You know, as a folklorist, I might say, but as a storyteller, I'd say, hey, you know, and I say they're viruses. They go and they mutate, and there's no way to stop them. And don't think you can own the story just because you made it up. And if you tell it, it's gone. You can't get it back. You can't get it back. You know.
Yeah, we have one of our members here, Sri Vidya Venkat, and she heard me tell the Taylor. And she took it away, and she has redone it. I think she's called it the Clever Tailor, and reset it completely in India. And all the clothing items are, all the items in the story are drawn very much from her culture, and that's fabulous. And the illustrations, they got an Indian artist to work on that. So complete retelling of the story. Yeah.
And that's the folktale process.
Yes.
Because you know, for 4,000 years, stories have been told, they've been passing around the world, and they've been changing, adapting to cultures, being retold, adapting to families, to this grandmother, that grandfather. Everybody makes them their own. Yeah.
This one links to earlier, right at the start, when you shared the story of Rikki Tikki Tembo. And interestingly, I remember, because I was concerned about it as a story, and I read somewhere that that it was, yes, a Japanese story, and that had been written in the kind of 1920s, and that possibly, given the political context of the time, this idea of perhaps making fun of a very long Chinese names was why the story had been set in China, which that made sense to me on one level. And so whenever I tell the story, I frame it and say that although the story is set in China, that I don't personally believe that it is a Chinese story.
I read that somewhere too, but I couldn't verify that for this session, so I didn't say that. But yeah, I think you're absolutely right about that.
Yeah. So here's an interesting question. I think it's Priti has asked this. I tell a Japanese story about why the sea is salt, and recently found out that there was an earlier story from Norway. So my Japanese story has Japanese elements, but
And there's no way of knowing which story came first. I mean, that story is told all around the world. It's told in Russia. You can look at my index and you'll find a lot of versions of that story. It's told all over the place. So, and there's no way of knowing which one came first. You have to do a lot of research and still you wouldn't know.
Yeah. Can we twist the ending of a folktale? Yes. So that's the question. Can we twist the ending?
Again, it's the same thing. These are stories. They're folktales. They're out there. Yes, you can change it all you want to. If you're going to publish it, explain what you did. Say, I changed the ending because I thought this would be more fun. But like the folktales, there's no police going to get you. Yeah, yeah.
Annamika has an interesting one. What if you hear the story orally from a primary teller, but then also find it in print subsequently? So who do you give the credit to? How do you go about that if you want to write it?
Okay, if you have it from an oral teller, please, if you publish it, cite that teller, and like I said, with who they were, their age, when you collected it, where they lived, when you collected it, and if you have and then also say the story also appears in print in this source and this source and this source. But those aren't really your sources. Your source is your actual, the person that you heard it from, probably, unless you took bits from the others and changed it too. So cite them all. Cite them all.
Thanks. That's a very clear answer. Thank you for that one. Someone was asking, is there an open source about the kind of classification of stories? Originally, I misunderstood that because you were referring to 398.2, which is the name, of course, of our storytelling festival here. But that's the Dewey library system of organizing. Right. But that just, but when you talk about classifying stories, is there like an open source for that, or?
Two things, public libraries, and I think libraries in most countries use this same classification scheme. I'm not sure, but in the U.S. it's a Dewey Decimal, which is 398 or 398.2, or there are many other numbers. There's a certain number for each culture, actually, or there's also a Library of Congress number that's used in bigger collections in university libraries, and there the folktales are in GR, which is a totally different section. So it's a different number. So public libraries and school libraries use Dewey, and the university libraries use Library of Congress, a different number. But maybe you're talking about folktale motifs and types. Folklorists classify folktales according to motif and type. And when I began, I was talking about Cinderella having motifs of going to the ball 3 times, losing a glass slipper, having an evil stepmother. These are motifs that appear within the story. There are other stories where girls go to balls 3 times, or lose a token, or have an evil stepmother. So a man named Stith Thompson, a folklorist, created a motif index of folklore all around the world, 6 volumes, and it's an index to all these stories. And then he and a folklorist from Finland called Antti Arni created a tale type. So each story also has a type, like Cinderella is one tale type, but it has many motifs. And so folklorists use those terms. And it's a very useful way to classify folktales, because if you're a folklorist in Japan and you're a folklorist in France and you meet at a conference, you're probably speaking English, and the Japanese teller says, I have a version of R777, and the French person says, I have a version of R772, and you know what you're talking about, same story. And it worked for me exactly when I was in Thailand as a guest of Wayupatosa to teach at the university. I was supposed to be teaching local stories to her students, and they were all in the Thai or Lao script in little booklets that had been mimeographed in the library, but the folklorists who had collected them had put in the type and motif numbers. So I had my motif index. I simply looked up the number and I knew what the story was.
Yeah.
And I knew which stories I wanted to use to tell children, and I could have my translator translate just that story, not the whole book.
Very useful. Yes, I mean, it reminds me of like it's the comedians all sitting around in heaven, and one just says, you know, joke number 117, and everybody laughs. And when the guy says 121 and nobody does, they say, oh, it's the way you tell it. So, because I think several people are asking, how do you, you know, categorize a story? And again, this is something that I've, you know, never solved for myself, because obviously I have a, you know, a large repertoire, and there are lots of stories that I don't tell regularly, and which I'm sure that I've forgotten. Whereas if you have this, then you could go in and say, oh, I'm looking for a story about whatever the motif is, the theme, and then you would be able to kind of group them together. So it is quite a an important strategy, I think, to develop. That you have a way of classifying, and rather than reinventing the wheel, I think it probably would be a good idea for us to try and also find out about R77.
Yeah. Well, and these and then other folklorists all around the world use those same schemes to do indexes. And in your handout, there's an index from Korea, an index from China, which are using the same type numbers that Arnie Thompson used in their type index.
Very good, very good. Okay. I'm thinking, so we are getting through. There's one here. I want to know about the poetics of a folk tale. Not quite sure I understand that question. Would that mean something to you, Margaret, or shall I ask the asker to ask that question?
Yeah. Okay. No. She wrote down. It means, is there any form? And well, in my stories, because I really like audience participation, and I really like repetition. Yes, my stories are actually very poetic. I'm really trying to shape them so that there's a form that they follow, and you can see that in the story of the octopus. That, you know, I'm using repetition. In Roger's story, the tailor, the way he shaped it, the same way, the repetition, and the same language being used over and over again. So it's like a poem, and yes, it's following a very specific poetic shape.
Been asked here.
Okay, so someone's asking if there are any index sources online.
Yeah.
No, the one that I mentioned, Ashleman has quite a few stories that you can find in his, but there aren't any indexes online. There are some that there's one. Sid Thompson is available, but you have to belong to the university that has it to access it, so it's not really readily available. It is available online, Sid Thompson, but you have to belong to the university system that's housing it to get into it.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, yeah.
We have one here that was from Paul about cultural appropriation. That if you change the setting of a story, would that get you into trouble for cultural appropriation?
Okay, now this is a whole different question, cultural appropriation. And yes, you can be, you know, you can be accused of cultural appropriation, and anytime you take a story and tell it at all, or change it. So you know, it depends on your situation. The story, for example, of the drunken crocodile that I retold in the picture book that we talked about. I had a friend, Ifat Majudu, who lived here in Seattle, a storyteller who belonged to our guild. And Ifat was from Zimbabwe, and he was furious with the Tracys because he said that the stories in their book belonged to his family and came from his family. Ifat has passed away and he's not around anymore. If he had still been living here and still been a friend when I went through the picture book, I probably wouldn't have done the picture book, because I would have felt that he would consider it cultural appropriation and would not have approved, and I wouldn't have wanted to hurt his feelings to do that. But since I no longer am associated with him and know him, I didn't think it was a problem. In reality, I'm sure the story was told by many people in his tribe, in his culture, not just him. So who does the story belong to? In each culture, many people tell the same story, and it belongs to the culture as a whole, but not to any one story. But yeah, that's something to worry about. And if you're worried about that, don't change the story. But if it isn't an issue, then change the story. But I say that there's no folklore police that are going to get you.
Yeah, but as you said, I think there are some issues in integrity here. There's another question. How do you feel about dressing a story in another culture and not saying so?
I think it depends. I don't see a problem with the tailor. I don't think you have to always say that it was originally a Jewish folk tale. You know, the story's being told so widely and passed around so widely that not you know, folks probably wouldn't even know that it was originally a Jewish folk song. So you know, and again, and as far as cultural appropriation goes, I don't tell stories from the Pacific Northwest when I'm living here because there are Native Americans who can tell their own stories here. But when I'm in Southeast Asia, I do tell those stories because otherwise you won't hear them, and they won't be shared. So it kind of depends on you know who your friends are, where you are, you know.
Yeah, who your audience is, absolutely.
Yeah.
At a good time. Sure.
Roger, Kiran here.
Yes, Kiran.
Margaret, living in Australia, all the tellers in Australia are very wary of telling the Aboriginal stories, people, our Indigenous stories. And like you, if I find a story in print, then I will bring that book with me when I'm out of Australia and tell that story. But it's not something I would be comfortable doing here in Australia.
Yes.
But if I don't bring it, like you, I feel that these stories need to be shared. And the thing is, because it's already in print, I feel that justifies, you know, the retelling. Yeah.
The cat's already out of the bag.
Yeah.
Native American stories and I think Aboriginal stories, sometimes they're really closely related to religion and you know tradition of people that are private and shouldn't be shared. So it depends on the story. Some of the stories are just fun stories for kids, and they don't mind them at all. And some are really important stories from the culture that have great meaning and shouldn't be disrupted.
Well, those wouldn't get told anyway, but just passed down to members of the family, and they wouldn't get told. Yeah.
Okay. Other questions? It's all very tricky.
Yeah.
Can I add something?
Yes, Steva.
All right. I would like to definitely give, I give credit to Margaret. Margaret, I'm very happy to do your stories in Tamil, in my mother tongue. And it works. And it works brilliantly. And I always say that the story, the original is from Margaret. It's her story. And I do it, which also includes the two goats. And Jack and the Robbers. They just work brilliantly. But it's just that the jiggle-tijig changes into a Tamil chant. Because jiggle-tijig will not fit into that. So we have changed that. So we do all those things and it still works. Is it okay to just change the language? Is it okay to tell in different languages?
Yeah.
As long as it works.
Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Definitely.
Yeah, all right. Nice.
And all my stories, of course, mine are in the books just for you to tell. They're meant to be told and shared. So that's good. And so now someone's going to hear it in India and pass it on. It'll become an Indian folktale too now.
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Margaret. I think we've really, you've answered a lot of questions and answered them very clearly. Thank you very much. It's obviously a complicated subject, and it does require, I think, every one of us to, find our own path and to, with that integrity, as you say, tell stories that you are comfortable with and that work for you. but be aware that the situation is changing around the world, and the story that we perhaps could tell 5 years ago, that the political or social cultural climates do change, and you do need to be very aware of the audience and the context with which you are speaking.
Norman Perrin, is that you down there?
Norman?
I've unmuted myself.
Oh, great.
There. Oh, thank you. If you have any questions about folklore, he has 6,000 folklore collections in his house right now. Is that correct, Norman?
Oh, wow.
He's got the index. He's got the index right there. Okay.
No, I've been resisting putting up postings because I don't know what handouts you have. In fact, I've been biting my tongue a lot. But I just wanted to put this in here. Respect the Source by Vi Hilbert. And it's a rather general term, but it leads to respecting the source means looking for the source, honoring the original intent of the story. Don't turn a serious sacred story into a piece of jokery or whatever, things like that. And I assume that's in line of what you've been talking about, Margaret.
Yes. And Vi felt strongly that her stories should be told and must be told. And a lot of the stories that I tell in Southeast Asia are Vi's stories. But she, had great arguments with other native people, native elders who didn't agree with her. But she felt that stories needed to be told, and she made it her point to put them in books and try to get people, even had workshops trying to get people to learn them and retell them.
Yeah. Sure. One more thing is that a storyteller I know, Lenore Keshik-Tobias, who's an activist and a writer and a storyteller here in Ontario, put it that you took our land, you took our culture, you took our children, they were literally kidnapped, and now you want our stories. Yeah. And you leave us nothing. So what that tells me is that, yes, it may be appropriate to tell certain stories, but also there's a time to let go for a while and let the stories be exchanged and given rather than taken, if you understand what I mean by that. So this is why the difference between different native storytellers. For some, fine. For others, please, hands off.
It's been great having you here in what is the middle of the day for us. I'm sure people are getting hungry here in Singapore, but I certainly feel that I have been fed in another way. And thank you so much, Margaret, for sharing some very practical ways that we can manage to get through this minefield of distinguishing what is a folktale and preparing, as I'm sure a lot of us would like to do, prepare those stories for publication. So thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank
you.
Bye.
Thank you all. It's been
stay safe.
Thanks.
Bye,
everybody.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye.